Well, I'll tell you about this thing later. It's very old. It's more than 100 years old, this machine. Much older than your iPhones. Amanda, I first got to know through reading something by her in the North American weekly magazine New Yorker. The New Yorker is called, right? I was on holidays in South Carolina and saw this magazine somewhere. And I knew the name before, but I had never bought it. It was quite cheap when you buy it, and when the printed version is, I don't know, $1 or $2, I think.
Really?
No, it's $6 or $7.
Yes.
But when you subscribe to it,
it's like $1.
It's like $1. It's so cheap.
Yeah, worth it. I hope.
Definitely worth it. And I can only recommend reading it. And we talk about writing about music later because that's Amanda's profession. I saw her name and then I got in touch because I wanted Amanda to come to Pop-Kultur in 2016, and then Amanda, because she's also teaching, could make it, and now she's here. And also we also follow each other on Instagram, so it's quite amazing seeing someone in the flesh now. We know more about each other than I don't know, than other people know about each other. But we know where we go on holidays. I know that Amanda went to, let's say, the former Yugoslavia for a research trip and everything. So it's great that you're here. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for having me, Martin. And thank you all so much for coming. I'm thrilled to be here.
And so I just wanted to start with, two quotes from Amanda. The first thing is, and I came across it again this morning, and I find it quite uplifting because I also like to write. And Amanda, in her book that I'll introduce in a second, she writes, "On a good day, writing can feel like a form of collecting, of gathering words, images, and ideas and arranging them in an order that feels right." And the other quote I wanted to start with goes like this: "I was a pretty good kid with rebellious aspirations. I spent most of my adolescence listening to punk rock bands on my plastic sports Walkman, and like many young music fans, I self-identified via my record collection, for me a sticker-coated trunk packed with cassettes. Because I came of age during the pinnacle of grunge, I further expressed that identity via Doc Martens Manic Panic." I don't know what that is.
Oh, Manic Panic is this hair dye. You can,
okay.
give yourself pink hair.
Okay.
Yeah.
Manic Panic and flannel shirts I pilfered from my father's closet. As I grew older, my communion with music became more complex and less visceral, but it was still my primary method of self-expression. I was, and this I think is another great sentence, I was what I heard always, and I eventually parlayed those delusions into something resembling a career as a music critic." Amanda, where do I start? What got you interested in music in the first place? Is there, I don't know, was your mother, in my case, that was the case, listening to radio all the time?
Yeah,
was it?
It's funny, it didn't, for me, my love of music kind of, I think, sort of came about in spite of my parents a little bit. They're lovely people, but they're not really music fans.
I know them from Instagram.
Yeah. Martin knows all my secrets. For me, it was, I think, a way within my family and sort of within the world I grew up in. And I'm sure many of you as music fans kind of feel similarly. It was a way of sort of insulating myself. It was my own, I could put my headphones on and it was my own little world where, sort of nothing could touch me. So I grew up just from a very young age being a sort of obsessive listener of music. I never really played. I took piano lessons when I was a kid, and I can sort of read music. But for me, it was always kind of consumptive. I wanted to be enveloped by a song. I wanted to kind of disappear into it. There was so much sort of peace in that for me. And then later on, as I kind of came of age as a writer, I found that for me the best way to sort of make sense of the music that I loved and to kind of get closer to it and figure it out was to write about it.
Well, and I didn't know that you took piano lessons. I did the same, but then we are both here and not on a stage.
Yeah.
Do you think we are? I mean, my job is also like circles around music, but it's not actually music, as in
Right.
music making. And the same goes for you. Do you think there's a I don't know, a loss? No, there's something we didn't.
What's wrong with us?
Yeah. Did you ever want to be a pop star, pop singer? Were there moments where you thought, oh, I'd like to be on that stage?
Not really. I mean, I think for me, I loved writing, and writing certainly is its own kind of performance, although it's a really private act. And I think I liked that about it, not to sound like a total maniac, but I think I liked being sort of, alone with a record and alone with my thoughts and sort of, I don't know, working through it in a way that was maybe a little less performative. I think I don't know about you, Martin. I feel like I would make a terrible pop star for many reasons, but one of which is I'm kind of shy. I mean, I think many writers sort of feel that way. There's something nice about the kind of solitude of the work. Although, of course, when you're a music critic, you spend a lot of time, sort of out in the world at shows and sort of engaging with music publicly. But I liked having those experiences and then being able to kind of process them in private.
And who taught you how to write? Because I mean, you're not that old, but still, I mean, but still, I'm sorry.
No, it's true. Yeah.
But I mean, I can only imagine that there weren't courses at university, or was there creative writing classes at school? No.
No, I mean, I really, as a kid, obsessively read Rolling Stone magazine, which is a music magazine in the States. I'm sure there's probably a German language version of it too. Probably has been for a long time. Rolling Stone, Spin. I would go to I grew up not very far outside of New York City, so I would, sneak out of my parents' house and take a train into the city and hang out in East Village. I bought a lot of zines, which I don't know if there's, I'm sure there's a zine culture in Berlin as well. So kind of little stapled together things. I was a big punk fan as a kid, and that was a great way to learn about those bands. So I feel like those early, I read a lot of rock journalists growing up. And kind of loved the energy and the sort of rhythm of that type of prose, which I think when it's done really well can sort of approximate the song. It feels like a musical kind of writing, and I really loved that. But yeah, the education was all sort of out of school. In school I did read a lot and sort of learned how to become a nonfiction writer in a way, and I've studied journalism and other things. But the music criticism in particular. Yeah, I mean, I really learned it reading record reviews, and I kind of came, as Martin pointed out, I'm quite old. So I came of age.
I said not that old.
I know, I'm just joking. I kind of came of age as a listener before you could really find things online, sort of pre-Napster, certainly pre-Spotify, pre-digital music online. So for me, if I wanted to hear about new music and I wanted to know what something sounded like and I wanted to know whether it was worth spending my money on, I had to read critics, I had to read music magazines, I had to read critics in newspapers to kind of get a sense of what was available. So they were really crucial for me, I think, both as a young writer and a young listener, just reading those magazines, reading those zines.
And now that you teach at the NYU, right?
Yes.
Do you sometimes think it's wrong to teach it, or do you try to teach it in a way that maybe? Well, because you weren't exactly taught. I mean, you were taught on the streets. Yeah. The streets were your university. But yeah. I mean, in what way can one teach writing about music?
Yeah, it's a great question. As I'm sure, as many of you who read music journalism know, there's it can take a lot of different forms. I mean, sometimes a tweet can be the sort of best possible encapsulation of a record. Other times you might want to read 1,500 words on something. So it's tough to say, well, this is how you do this. This is the right way to do this. Here's how to be a music critic. You have to do this, and this. So I feel like as a professor, the kind of thing I focus on the most is is trying to teach my students how to listen better, how to be sort of more awake to the songs that they're hearing, how to kind of figure out a way to contextualize those records or contextualize an artist within their moment or within, their discography or sort of in some conversation with what's happening culturally around them. So all of that stuff I think is really important for good music journalism, that it not only sort of describe what you're hearing and some of the choices that the artist has made and how those choices are working or not, but also to sort of figure out how it works within its particular time and place. So we spend a lot of time doing that. We'll listen to a song and I'll often play things for them, that they've never heard before and they don't know anything about it. And we'll try to just sort of look at the song itself, almost in a vacuum. What are the sounds, sort of what are you hearing? What kind of feelings or experiences is it invoking for you? What memories is it bringing up? So we'll sort of try to deal with the thing itself and then kind of zoom our cameras out and look at it in a sort of bigger way. Who is the artist? What have they done before? Where did they come from? Are they part of a scene? How does this song, which maybe is number 1 on the Billboard chart, how does it sort of work with the song that's number 2? And what is going on in our world right now that these are the 2 most popular songs in America, or sort of whatever those questions are. So we kind of start small and then go bigger.
And do you sometimes realize that there's a student who's where you think, well, he's or she's an even better writer than me, and do you sometimes can you make out as a teacher where, or do you allow yourself to say to someone, maybe you should not write about music, but maybe do something else? I'm always wondering because how life-changing can you be, or must you be, or is that? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I mean, music journalism as a job right now is a tricky thing.
It's not really something you would recommend.
No,
to someone,
I mean,
right?
it's really, it's always been difficult, I think, to make a living doing this, and it's only getting more and more difficult. So that side of it, where I can sort of steer them, to ways where they might actually be able to pay their rent in an easier way. But I mean, I have students all the time who surprise me with how amazing, how astute and sort of smart and sharp they are. And part of that, I think, is and maybe those of you who've read a lot of music journalism will sort of get this. Music journalism can become very formulaic. I mean, record reviews can feel very formulaic. They can feel sort of full of cliches. Writers are using the same dozen words over and over again to describe the way an electric guitar sounds. So sometimes my students, I think by virtue of being kind of new to the discipline, will write these amazing, surprising sentences that are incredible just because they haven't yet kind of internalized that, those sort of directives or those cliches of the form. But it is tricky, I think, as a teacher. You're certainly not doing anyone a favor to kind of encourage a writer who maybe doesn't sort of have the skill that you need to kind of keep going. But it's also hard. I mean, they're young and certainly when I was that age, I'm sure I was writing a lot of terrible sentences and paragraphs, and who knows? People learn, but it is a tricky thing to sort of, say, well, okay, maybe this isn't quite for you. Maybe try, but you are really good at this. But it's hard.
Could I just quickly ask you how you actually make your living? You don't have to tell us how much money you receive for an article, but I mean, do you, for the New Yorker, who you write for, which you write for on a constant basis, do they pay you a monthly salary, or is it per words or per character, or do you wait for them to call you? Do you have to go up to them and say, well, I've got this great idea about writing about MTV and Chance the Rapper? Or do they come to you? And what about other magazines?
Sure.
How does that work?
Yeah. Well, I am at the moment under contract with The New Yorker. So they pay me an annual salary for which I write a column a week for the website and probably about a dozen columns a year for the magazine. So at The New Yorker, they don't run record reviews in the kind of traditional sense. They're more sort of little critical essays. They're about 1,200 or 1,500 words, and it's been a nice kind of avenue, or a nice sort of venue for me, because I like writing about music that way. I think I'd prefer to sort of do a little essay about something rather than kind of slap a score on it and make some sort of big declarative judgment about whether it's good or not. So I've been under contract with the New Yorker, so I have a salary as a staff writer there for 2 years. But prior to that, I worked as a freelance critic in New York. So I'd started when I finished graduate school. My first job out of school was at a website called Pitchfork, which maybe some of you know. Back then, it was a very different kind of website. It was sort of new, and people weren't really sure. We covered almost exclusively indie rock and the sort of weirder edges of pop music. And I was writing 2 reviews a week for them, and features, and interviews with bands and stuff like that.
Did you get paid there, or was
I did get paid, very little. I was working a million other jobs. I was working in a restaurant. I was working in a bar. And I had written, and also freelancing for other places. So it's, as a freelance writer, and I'm sure this is true in Germany as well as in the States, it's just a kind of constant hustle. You're constantly pitching ideas. You're constantly trying to come up with ideas about bands. You're constantly trying to hear the next thing that people are going to be into. And then on top of that, you might hear a record you really like. You might go see a band that, isn't necessarily the band you were there to see, but it's the opening band, and they just sort of destroy you, and you're so stoked to write about it. But you've still got to find a kind of way to turn it into a story, to really make it interesting for your readers. And that's also what magazine editors are looking for when they receive pitches from critics. It's sort of, well, what's the narrative here? What's the arc? All right, here's this band you really liked, but that's 3 sentences. How do I make this into a sort of whole big magazine feature that people will want to read? So I started at Pitchfork and then began writing for the New York Times, other magazines, GQ, Esquire, Playboy, The Atlantic, Spin, Rolling Stone. And I think at one point in my early career, it was, like a dozen different magazines. And that's how you sort of piece together a living. It's kind of a little bit here and there. And around that time, I started becoming interested in doing longer projects. I became interested in working on a book. And so that's nice. One of the kind of great things a book contract will offer you is an advance, which means your publisher kind of advances you a part of the money they've promised you so that you can live while you write the thing. So that helped too, but I think it would be really difficult to be a music critic now and not be able to sort of do a million different things at once, because you do, and then later I became a full-time teacher at NYU. So it's, you've always kind of got your hand in a few different pots.
And also now, because we as a music journalist, you don't receive promos anymore, which in my days we used to sell at the second-hand record store. That was the pay. You sold the CDs, you got the promo CDs. Now you only get, it's not a secret.
No, everybody sold them.
And now it's only streams you get, watermarked streams.
Yes, it's true. I know, you can't eat those. You can't live off those.
Because you mentioned the book, maybe it's time now to just to talk about the book. In a second, maybe we can speak about writing a book in general. Is that something where I know plenty of writers, and for all of them, their dream is to write a book. It doesn't necessarily have to be a novel, but it has to be a book of some sort. So when you wrote your book, would you consider this as being a high point in your career?
Yes, no, absolutely.
And it's also something that makes the parents happy, I think.
Oh my God, so happy. My parents didn't really understand Pitchfork when I started working there. It was sort of endlessly confusing to them. No, I mean, there's nothing quite like getting that first box of books and you open the thing and your name's on the cover and you kind of can't believe it. But yeah, absolutely. And I think a book sort of endures in a way that, writing a review for a website maybe sort of won't. I mean, I'm sure you guys are all kind of intimately familiar with the sort of pace at which the culture moves now. It's like we're all talking about something, like right now, everyone on earth seems to be talking about this perhaps forthcoming Taylor Swift record. And then, like a day later, everyone will be talking about something else. It sort of occupies everyone's mind in a kind of crazy way for a brief period of time. And then it seems like very quickly the culture sort of moves on to the next thing. So the nice thing about a book is yeah, it just slows everything down. It takes a long time to write one. It takes a while for it to be published, and then it sort of remains, for a far longer time than just publishing a review somewhere. So very exciting.
So what I'll do now is, I'll play a record later, but what I wanted to do now is pass this thing around. I've never played it. I don't think it's worth that much, but maybe you can pass it around. It's a very old MP3. It's called Shellac, and it's from, I don't know, could be 100 years old. No, maybe not. But you can feel it. They are quite, how do you say, what's the word, sturdy?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then I want it back later, please. But you can feel it and touch it. So what made you write about this ancient medium?
Sure. So my book is called "Do Not Sell at Any Price," and it's about collectors of very rare 78 RPM records. So the
78 is the speed with which the record revolves.
Turns. Yeah. So that's revolutions per minute. So the big kind of 12-inch vinyl records, that's a 33 1/3, and then the little ones are 45s. 78s predate all of those, and they were mostly sort of, the technology was introduced around the turn of the 20th century and mostly sort of phased out by the 60s. But I first became interested in it in part because I had been working on a magazine story at the time for Spin magazine about the kind of commercial resurgence of vinyl records in the United States. At the time, I think Metallica and Nine Inch Nails had each reissued their whole back catalogs on 180-gram vinyl. So I was doing this little magazine story about it. And I was talking to some people who collect records, record collectors in New York. And at the time, one of them had told me, people, and I'm sure maybe some of you know folks like this, people that obsessively collect records are in general sort of a crazy and interesting lot, but people that collect these records, these very, very old 78 RPM records, are particularly nuts. And that's in part because 78s, they were produced in far more limited quantities because, the whole sort of idea of recorded sound was very new back then. But as Martin was saying, they are kind of heavy and very brittle. So they're not pliable or sort of bendable in the way that a vinyl record is. And if you drop one, they're very, very easy to crack. So they're rare, and some of them, particularly early American blues and jazz, some of those records, there may be one or two kind of known copies of the thing left in existence. So the men, and it tends to usually be men who collect them, are kind of coming at it with this sort of, maniac excitement and energy. So it was interesting to me as a kind of oddball subculture story of the small sort of community of people that obsessively were hunting these records down. But it was also interesting to hear some of the songs that they contained, in part because, as Martin was saying, it was a sort of time in my life in which I was receiving a great deal of promo CDs in the mail every day, and just feeling, and I'm sure anyone with a Spotify account sort of knows this feeling, I was feeling like there's just too much. There's too much music, and I kind of can't keep up with it, and I don't really find myself getting particularly invested in any of it. So I was feeling a little worn out. And there was something about the smallness of 78s I liked. They're kind of hard to come by. You never really know what's going to be on one if you find it at a junk shop or whatever. And so that appealed to me too, the kind of slowing down that it required. And as you can see, they're kind of complicated to play. And it's a whole.
It's like we rehearsed it. That's a very. It's great.
Yeah, perfect timing.
Yes, perfect timing. Where did you? Well, I think we'll play it first, right?
Sure.
Is that okay? Yeah. I hope I did everything correct. Let me quickly quote you. In this book, Do Not Sell at Any Price, Amanda writes, "Here's a simple truth. If you want to make someone's day, play them Skokian. Skokian?
Skokian.
Skokian.
Yeah, yeah. Yes.
If they've never, like you, have heard it before, they will never forget you." That's us, right?
That's us.
Yeah. Musarugwa's wobbly saxophone carries the melody, and its particular tone is unlike anything else I've ever heard. His performance isn't frantic or even drunk. It's sweet and effortlessly joyful. A slipped guffaw, right? Also, when you read Amanda's writing, you learn, or I learn, quite a few new words every time. You know quite a few words, I think. Other words that I know. A good long laugh. It's one of the most human sounds ever committed to record. There's so many questions I now have in my head. Is this very expensive? Or where did you buy it?
Yeah. So Skokian was recorded at the very end of the 1940s in southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, and it's an old drink. Yeah. Hey. Do you know the song?
I was actually telling him that when I was in high school, we actually were taught how to play it on marimbas, like xylophone.
Oh, no way. That's so cool.
I think that's Skokian.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's so awesome. That makes me so happy. So the band is called the Bulawayo Sweet Rhythms Band, and it's like an old Zulu drinking song. And Skokian itself was a kind of illicit sort of moonshine that people would make and get kind of wonderfully drunk off of. I will say most of the songs that are featured in the book are kind of sad songs. I mean, I write a lot about the blues, and many of the collectors that are featured in Do Not Sell at Any Price are blues collectors. And I think in part, the kind of collector mentality, and I don't know, how many of you maybe have a record collector in your life, but they tend to be sort of outliers. They're sort of outsiders, and they tend to be kind of drawn to music that I think is really full of sort of longing or a certain kind of sadness or a certain kind of alienation. So I wanted to play this record because it's such a joyful song, and just kind of, I think, sort of infectious and really beautiful and fun to hear. So it was recorded at the end of the 1940s, and at some point a copy of the record of this particular, not this particular 78, but a 78 of the song made its way to Cleveland, Ohio, which is a kind of funny Midwestern town in the States. And a radio DJ there played it on the radio in Cleveland, and he played it 4 times. And the station just got completely overwhelmed by people calling in and being like, what's that song? American audiences has never really heard jazz quite like that. It had later, was covered by Louis Armstrong. It was covered by a lot of artists in the States. But it had a sort of strange moment in which it charted on the American Billboard charts in 1954, in part because it had just, a military pilot had, picked up a copy in Africa and had brought it back with him to Ohio. So it was sort of fun for me as a writer to kind of, trace the sort of material history of these records, that were made and would spread in this very human way. I mean, now things spread very quickly online, but back then you had to actually buy the thing. You had to buy the piece of shellac and fly it all the way home and hand it to someone, and they'd play it on the radio. So it all just sort of happened a little bit more slowly. But that was first played for me by a collector named Sarah Bryan. She's the only female.
She's the only female collector.
Yeah, the only female collector featured in the book. And she played it for me at her home in North Carolina. And she had just sort of come across it at a flea market, had paid like $1 for it somewhere. Yeah, and she actually ended up giving me that copy.
Oh,
so that
wow.
record is, once belonged to Sarah. And now I get to have it. Yeah.
Wow. It's great that it's, and now it's traveled to Berlin.
Now it's traveled to Berlin.
It's quite amazing.
It's so cool.
And we could never talk about, I'm not saying, I love MP3s, and it's great that I can send my friend Will in London a song, and a minute later it's there, or I can send him a link, and that link can also spread. But at the end of the day, I often think we've got these hands. We've got these hands for reasons, right? For a reason, right?
Yeah.
Do you ever get sad when you think about this medium having died and now it's all just files, or do you embrace files and streaming? I really love streaming.
Yeah, of course. How could you not, right? It's incredible. It's a sort of incredible moment to be alive, in which the sort of whole history of recorded sound is, in your pocket. But there is something about, I think something that maybe got lost with the format is the kind of intimacy of it, or the sort of smallness of it. Or I don't know, Martin, if you've had a similar experience of just, you like open Spotify, or you open whatever, you open your iTunes library, you just think like, I don't know, it's too much, right? Like at a certain point it becomes kind of too much, and it can be sort of paralyzing in that way. So I like this. I like that, you have to sort of make a decision, and it's a limited amount of choices in a way. So that really appealed to me. There's also something I think about the way the old records sound. They're imperfect. And depending on who owned it before you, you can kind of hear all of that. If somebody played a record a lot, it will sound different than if somebody owned a record and didn't play it very often. So there is this kind of, very human sort of thing in there, where you can sort of hear that whole history of ownership on the surface of the thing. That's sort of nice.
And you often, from Instagram, I know that you like visiting flea markets.
Yeah.
Do you use the term flea markets, or is there or boot sale, or
we say flea market in the States, yeah.
And we say Flohmarkt. It's the same word. Do you still find them?
I do, yeah. I find them.
And you just buy. Do you look at the labels, or do you just get, 10 for 10?
Yeah, sometimes. That's another fun thing about it, is you buy these records and you don't really know what's on them. It's often artists that would, maybe record one song in their lifetime. It wasn't the sort of, now you get a record contract, it's a whole sort of thing. People would just come into these, temporary recording studios would get set up in small towns, or people would come in to sort of audition for a record label, and they'd make a record. So there's all these kind of amateur musicians that would record things, and you do have a sense of, you're getting, and they had one take, no edits, no overdubs, no production to speak of. They just sort of did their thing in front of a microphone. So you do get a sense that you're getting this little sort of, and they hold about 2 or 3 minutes of music each side. So it's a very kind of quick little glimpse of one moment in time from a very long time ago. And I think people that made 78s too, some of the early recording artists, didn't really have a sense yet that they were sort of making an artifact. So there's a kind of lack of self-consciousness in a lot of the performances. We might hear a singer now, Beyonce makes a record, and it's, every sort of nanosecond of that thing is sort of sweated over in a way, right? I mean, it's got a lot of different hands on it. There's a lot of people sort of engineering it to be just so. And these records are not like that. There's, mistakes and sort of sour notes and kind of weird things that happen. And certainly, sort of moments I'm sure the artist wishes they could do over, but they can't. So there's a kind of spontaneity to it that I think is sort of fun. But yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of kind of early American blues and folk music. So I'm always looking for that stuff on 78. But it's also been fun for me. I'll kind of pick up a record if it has a language on it or writing on it that I don't understand. I don't even know where it came from. That's been a fun way for me to discover, kind of music outside of the place where I come from. So, all kinds of sort of world records and different sort of traditions from all over.
I wanted to tell you that this thing, that the history behind this thing that I got from a friend, I borrowed it from a friend. She bought it. Well, the company who sold it is based in Hamburg, and in Hamburg, after the Second World War, after the First World War, before the Second World War, there were these so-called jazz kids, and they listened to jazz, which wasn't accepted by the government. So they had these portable players, and they took them on the River Elbe, which is the river that goes through or along Hamburg. So it's quite likely that this thing was also used as some sort of political statement on a boat on the river in Hamburg, which I find quite moving, actually.
Yeah.
And it's more. I also really like my iPhone, but it's somehow.
You can have both.
I can have both. I have both.
Can you guys see it? Should we turn it around so they can maybe see the?
And also, feel free to take a look later.
So this is a portable gramophone, but you've probably seen the old Victrolas maybe in antique stores or in your great-grandparents' homes or your grandparents' homes. A lot of them were quite a bit bigger. It was like a piece of furniture you would sort of buy to have in your parlor. But this one's really cool because it was portable.
Well, I actually wanted, because I'm mentioning Instagram so often, can I just, I need to ask, what do you like about Instagram? And I think, if I may say that, you're a master at writing captions.
That's quite kind.
That was an easy compliment to make, because it's the truth. And I quickly, I made a screenshot of your recent post.
Oh no.
Where
it's
is
going to be a picture of my cat.
No, it's one you took last night or yesterday afternoon. Well, I don't think I'm a stalker. Amanda follows me as well.
That's true.
Yeah, she's a stalker as well.
Yeah.
Oh, we're both not stalkers, I would say. Well, and the cat. The captions, it's a photo of an old woman and a quite old man, and they are sitting not in this room, but in the room next door, and the it's not a headline, caption, right? You say caption.
Caption, yeah.
And the caption reads, "One of my favorite songs in the whole world is Blind Uncle Gaspard's arrangement of Sous les bords de l'eau, which he recorded for Vocalion Records in 1929. Tonight, I not only got to hear Shirley Collins sing it from mere feet away, exclamation mark in brackets, but she dedicated it to me too. I shook like a leaf the whole dang time." I think that's great writing. And
Thank you.
What I like about and what I like about it is that it's both nerdy, giving the year in which it was recorded, spelling everything correctly. I mean, quite a few people don't bother spelling it correctly. And then. But then making it personal, and I think that's for me great music writing, when you can actually when the writer is involved, and the dang is slang, and that I find also very funny. So it's everything at the same time within what, 80 words?
Yeah, I love Instagram. How many of you guys are on Instagram? Is it almost everyone? Okay, I feel like I see almost everyone's hands up. I mean, I think it's a really fun medium, and I feel like, you know, people complain a lot about social media and think it's sort of stealing our souls and, you know, ruining everybody's lives and et cetera. No one's living in their moment anymore. We're all whatever on our phones. But I think Instagram in particular is you know, for me as a writer, it's a different way of storytelling. I mean, I like taking photos and it's fun, and I like goofing around with my friends, which is fun. But I kind of think of it as an extension sort of the work in a way. I really enjoy it a lot. It's fun to see your posts too. But yeah, for sure. I I also think Instagram is sort of the best of all the social media platforms. It's kind of the most innocent in a way. I feel like Twitter can get really mean, and people are sort of horrible to each other on there. Facebook is, you know, a lot of pictures of babies and political articles. But I like that Instagram, it sort of allows its users to kind of create a sort of visual diary of their lives. So it's fun, you know, and I like sort of seeing what other people are seeing. I mean, I think it's a way of opening up the world, and yeah, it's pretty great.
We didn't get paid by Instagram to say this now. Whether it'll be more or less the last. Well, we've got 9 minutes left. The alarm will ring in 3 minutes, where the alarm means we have another 5. So it's 8 in total. Sorry.
It's very German.
Yeah, yeah, it's right.
I'm into it.
In an email you because on Instagram I saw that you were traveling in Europe, and I asked you whether we could speak about it, and your reply, and you said in an email you wrote to me, I was traveling in Albania for a piece that's not related to music. I'm writing about blood, and then now you have to tell me how to pronounce it. Feuds?
Yes, very good.
Yeah. The German word is Fehde. Do you know the German word Fehde? Yeah. In the accursed mountains, but I'm happy to talk about that too. So let's talk about it, because it's not related to music, but maybe, well, sounds exciting and also very frightening.
Yeah. Yes.
And your family is involved as well, not in the feud.
They're not in the blood feud.
But you got to meet your nieces, cousins?
Yeah. My family is. I don't know if anyone is here from Albania or the Balkans. Really? Oh, that's so cool. How awesome. It was my first time there, and it's an incredibly beautiful country. And that trip really was, you know, quite affecting for me. My family is from Croatia, so just outside of Dubrovnik. My father's family is from there, so it was kind of a fun opportunity for me to catch up with them. But it was so I write almost exclusively about music, but every once in a while I get an opportunity to report on something sort of outside of that immediate interest. So for me,
who commissioned this?
It'll be for the New Yorker, and so this is a story about blood feuds in northern Albania. So these kind of ancient oaths of revenge, and the sort of way in which, you know, Albania kind of suffered under a communist regime for many years, and because of that, sort of resorted to a kind of ancient law in which, you know, if you kill someone, or, you know, sometimes it would be over a property dispute or some other kind of wrong, if you wrong another family in some way, that they then have the right to sort of take revenge. So if I were to sort of kill one of Martin's cousins, then that would mean I would have to remain in hiding for the rest of my days, because you would have then the right to get blood to sort of even the score by killing me. So I was there reporting that and speaking to some families who'd been involved in these kinds of feuds, and sort of learning how they had begun, and you know, the ways in which they were continuing on, and you know, sort of talking to some of the people who'd been involved in trying to kind of mediate or solve the feuds. But it's always, that was a story that I had become interested in part because I'd done a piece for the New York Times Magazine a few years ago on the music of northern Greece. I don't know if there's any Greeks in the room. But in the mountains of northern Greece, they play this very kind of intense, hypnotic, improvised music, these sort of dirges or laments, and they will have these festivals called Panieri, where the whole village sort of gets together and they play this music for 3 days, and everyone dances, and you drink a just insane amount of Sapporo or of wine. And then on the end of the third day, the village sort of gets together and dances the band out of town. And the whole experience is just, really beautiful and sort of cathartic and interesting. And so when I had been in Greece, northern Greece, working on that story for the New York Times, I had met, so there was a musician who I'd wanted to interview, an Albanian musician, and someone said to me, well, he's not available for interviews, he can't leave his home because he's involved in a blood feud. So that sort of led into that story. So whenever you're reporting or writing, you're working on the thing that you're working on, but I feel like most writers sort of, you have kind of one eye out on like, well, what's the next thing? What else is happening here that, could potentially be a story down the line? So that was how I got involved in that. But it's always, as a music critic, I feel like, when you think about the things people sing about, right? I mean, the sort of whole songbook that's available to us. It's it's love and it's rage and it's revenge and all these things. So for me as a critic, I feel like anytime I get to a chance to report a story that's about some very sort of human emotion or some very kind of human thing, it all kind of comes back into the music writing, in a way. So yeah, that was a real thrill. It was very, very cool. It's always so fun to get to travel for this job, for sure.
When will it be out?
It will be out in October. There's a special issue of the magazine that's justice themed, so this will be for that.
Wow.
Yeah.
And do you, the very last question now, and how should we imagine you sitting in your Brooklyn office? Do you have an office or do you write at home? And I often wear, when I write, I have this old cardigan that I put on. And usually there's no music. What does it look like at Amanda Petrusich's Brooklyn home?
Sure. Well, I have an office at NYU where I teach, but I never write there. I like to write at home too. And much like Martin, I am often wearing something I would probably not wear outside, like an old Clash t-shirt that I've spilled coffee on probably. I also like to write without music playing, which sometimes surprises people because I write, primarily about music, but I sort of need to, I think there's a rhythm to a sentence and there's sort of a rhythm to good prose, and I need that in my head, and I feel like if something else was playing, the timing would be off for me. But yeah, I have a little room in my apartment that's filled with books and records, and I find that sort of comforting, to be there. I pace a lot when I'm writing. I'll write a sentence and then it's like hands up, and I do a couple laps around the room. I'm sure I look like a maniac. I'm sure if someone were to ever It's
good no one's watching.
Oh my God, it's so good no one's watching. But I do really love to write. I mean, I think different writers will sort of speak about this differently. But for me, it still kind of has somehow managed to remain a great source of joy. I like actually doing it. I like sitting down. I like typing. I like putting the words together. I like trying to figure out what I think about something. So I'm usually happy when I'm doing it. There's a lot of snacking.
Well, that's fine. Snacking is okay. Thanks so much for coming
Thank
all
you
the
guys
way
so
from
much.
America.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.